Hey everybody, my name is John Lamb, and this is Shakespeare Off the Shelf. Today I want to talk about, once again, A Midsummer Night's Dream. We're just a few pages in from the last video where we talked about Shakespeare's cold open, but today I want to talk about Hermia's resolve. Hermia, of course, as you know, is a character. She's one of the four lovers in the play, and she's in some ways the reason the plot rolls forward as it does, because her father, Aegeus, comes in and he is ticked off at the start of this play. He's angry because his daughter is in love with one man, and he, Aegeus, the father, has decided that Hermia is going to marry another man, Demetrius. And so that's the conflict that sets the play in motion. Aegeus, who is an official in Theseus' court of Athens, enters, and he's ticked off, he's upset, he says he's full of vexation, right there at the beginning on line 22. And Hermia comes in, and Hermia is there with him, as is Lysander and Demetrius, these two men, both of whom claim to love Hermia. Classic love triangle. And Theseus, initially, he takes Aegeus' side. Theseus asks, "What say you, Hermia? Be advised, fair maid. To you your father should be as a god, one that composed your beauties. Yea, and one to whom you are but as a form in wax, by him imprinted, within his power to leave the figure or disfigure it. Demetrius is a worthy gentleman." Now, we don't have time to linger on the weirdness of this speech and the fact that Theseus offers a metaphor of a wax figure, a wax seal. It's sort of a bizarre image in some ways for Theseus to choose to use for how a father relates to a daughter. But at least in terms of patriarchy, is certainly within the realm of imagination. The idea that the father gets to determine what happens to his daughter. There are still cultures today that think of father-daughter relationships in this way. Hang on, I need a drink of coffee. So that in some ways is not really surprising, the way that Theseus comes in, especially given what we already know about Theseus and the strange things he's already said to Hippolyta. But what's really great is Hermia's response, because Hermia responds with something that seems, at least certainly strikes many students that I teach, as refreshingly modern. She says, Demetrius is a worthy gentleman, Theseus just said, and Hermia responds, so is Lysander. Theseus, in himself he is, but in this kind, wanting your father's voice, the other must yield the worthier. The other must be held the worthier, She says, I would my father looked but with my eyes. Theseus, rather your eyes must with his judgment look. But here's where we get the really interesting and in some ways highly kind of evocative response from Hermia. She says, I do entreat your grace to pardon me. I know not by what power I am made bold, nor how it may concern my modesty in such a presence here to plead my thoughts. But I beseech your grace that I may know the worst that may befall me in this case, if I refuse to wed Demetrius. She already knows the situation. She is being compelled in some ways to marry Demetrius. She knows that her father has, at least in Theseus's eyes, a certain agency, a certain right to tell her whom she should marry. She doesn't say absolute yes, absolute no. She says, actually, it reminds me of when kids will say things like, I don't know why, but I really want dessert. And my response is always like, you want dessert because dessert's delicious and you just ate dinner. Of course you want dessert. You don't know why. She says, I know not by what power I am made bold. Well, in this case, it seems fairly clear that the power by which she's made bold is the fact that she is being compelled to marry a guy she doesn't really like very much. And she's not able to marry the guy she does like a lot. But she much like Hippolyta, she shows a certain kind of a canniness, a kind of nuance, a kind of rhetorical, pragmatic way of approaching Theseus here. And so she simply says, this is a fancy way of saying, what's the worst that can happen here? What's going to happen if I say no? And Theseus says, he gives the long speech, sort of famously, where he says, you're either going to die or you're going to have to become a nun. So those are her three choices: marry Demetrius, die, or become a nun. And he encourages her to question her desires and so on. We're going to skip that speech. I don't find that exciting or interesting, especially since he once again compares, in this case, he compares her to a rose distilled than that which grows and dies. It's a very strange speech, but I don't want to talk about it because her response is what's so interesting. He says, earthly or happy still is the rose distilled than that which, withering on the virgin thorn, grows, lives, and dies in single blessedness. And then Hermia says, so will I grow, so live, so die, my lord, ere I will yield my virgin patent up unto his lordship, whose unwished yoke my soul consents not to give sovereignty. Now this is a really interesting speech because he's just laid out the things that are going to happen to her, her choices, the thing that will happen to her in particular if she becomes a nun. And he compares it to a rose that withers on the vine, that withers on the branch rather than is plucked and used. Again, it's a very strange thing to say to a young woman, comparing her to a rose, just like comparing her to wax earlier. But instead of saying, well, we can imagine all kinds of alternatives, but what she says is, okay, I'll be the rose. I'll live, I'll die. I'll grow, I'll live, I'll die, before I give up my virgin patent, which is, in other words, that's her virginity, but also her marriage, her life, unto Demetrius. His lordship here is Demetrius, the guy who wants to marry her and has Aegeus's approval. What's fascinating to me is the way in which she manages to emphasize her refusal of consent. But she does it in a way that, one, actually uses the terms that Theseus has given her. That's where so will I grow, so live, so die, right? He's the one who gave her those terms. And she manages to kind of create a distance between saying, I consent not, or I don't consent, which is one kind of statement. That's a more overt refusal. And instead, she says that she puts it into it's a grammatically subordinate position. Whose unwished yoke my soul consents not to give sovereignty. So she actually creates a kind of distance by saying my soul consents not to give sovereignty. She gives, instead of having a direct refusal to Theseus, she gives a kind of sideways refusal. She says, my soul consents not to give sovereignty. And it's worth noting as an aside that she doesn't frame the response in terms of Aegeus's consent and her relationship with her father. She frames it in terms of her relationship with Demetrius. So it's not Aegeus's unwished yoke, it's Demetrius's that she's rejecting here. So she actually shifts the terms that began the whole conflict, because originally it was framed as Aegeus versus Hermia, and she reframes it in terms of Demetrius versus Hermia, which is a fundamentally different kind of relationship. Now, you might say it amounts to the same thing, and in some ways it very much does. But importantly, Theseus's response is actually a kind of retreat, because his response there is take time to pause, and by the next new moon, again, we have the reference to the moon in 4 days when they're going to get married, the sealing day betwixt my love and me for everlasting bond of fellowship, upon that day, either prepare to die for disobedience to your father's will, or else to wed Demetrius as he would, or on Diana's altar to protest for austerity and single life. So once again, he repeats the options she has. You either marry Demetrius, or you die, or you become a nun. He doesn't come down hard on her and say, no, you have to do this thing. He actually, based on her response to him, puts it in terms of her agency, her consent, and her choice. Now, those are constrained choices, which the rest of the play bears out, because in fact, they run away to the woods. This is the moment where they don't like any of those choices, she and Lysander, so off they go, and that's great. That's actually the fourth choice Theseus didn't mention. But what's fascinating to me is the way in which Hermia actually manages to navigate this situation rhetorically in a way that that takes a complete defeat and salvages her own agency and her own ability to consent from what had been a kind of closed door. Okay, that's all I got for today. Next time we'll talk about something fairy related. So, see you next time.